Okay, so our topic here is photosynthesis, and one of the obvious things that they like to ask in exam questions is to write a balanced equation. Now, if they're asking you to write a balanced equation, of course what they mean is the chemical equation, and it has to be a balanced chemical equation, rather than this, which is the word equation. So the word equation would be carbon dioxide and water molecules are stitched together, if you like, using light. And you notice the way I've put light here on the left hand side, really because light is used up in this chemical reaction rather than sitting here on top, which is often the way you'll see it in textbooks. So I think it's more correct to see it over here. Up on top here is fine too. What is necessary is chlorophyll, and that isn't used up, so we can put that on top. Chlorophyll is necessary for photosynthesis, so we have to put it here on top of the arrow. The products then of photosynthesis, and if you combine carbon dioxide and water, you get glucose and oxygen, which is largely, as we'll see later on, a waste product for plants. Although, of course, they do use some of it for, just like we do, like all living things, for respiration. So the balanced chemical equation is 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules stitched together with light to give you 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygens. You can see 6 figures quite a lot in this equation, so it's 6 of these, and 6 oxygens as a result. The carbohydrate that's produced then is a C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula for glucose. So you have to know that. Okay, so the overview then is the plants need chlorophyll. They need this pigment. They need this. It's not to make the plants green. It's chlorophyll. In fact, is a combination of all kinds of different pigments. Some of them different colors. Some green, some yellow, some brown. And together, what they do is their job is to absorb light energy so that the plant can harness that energy, use that energy, and turn it into chemical energy. So that's the if you like the summary or the overview of photosynthesis. It's the way plants that capture light energy and they use that energy to stitch together simple inorganic molecules using this energy and convert that energy, that light energy, into chemical energy in the form of glucose. So they need that. In plants, chlorophyll is found in chloroplasts and only in chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are specialized structures found only within eukaryotes and only within plants. There's a lot of chloroplasts in the palisade layer. We've seen that in the structure of the leaf before. The palisade layer is the upper mesophyll layer just below the epidermal layer, the dermal layer of the leaf. So you get a lot of concentration, high concentration of chloroplasts in there. Chlorophyll, like I said, they're molecules that have evolved to be exceptionally good at absorbing light energy and then passing it on to other molecules, to acceptor molecules. So when the light energy is absorbed, it's transferred. The light energy is taken by electrons, which become what we call excited or energized electrons. And these energized electrons then are able to be passed or moved from one protein, one electron acceptor molecule to the next. So we'll see how that works later on. Most of the time, to be honest, what happens is when electrons hit, when light particles or photons, when light energy is absorbed by chlorophyll molecules, nothing much happens. It's just the energy is dissipated as heat, and there's no photosynthetic event happens. But occasionally, electrons are energized and can then be used. That energy in the electrons can be used to generate ATP. Okay, so in the chloroplast then it's a double outer membrane, and we'll see how the details of that later on. And it's on these membranes, on these double membranes, the inner membranes, these folded inner membranes, which occur in this. We'll see in a second, in this particular pile of coin structure, but that is where you'll find the chlorophyll molecules. They sit there on top of sticking out of the membranes as little molecules lined up waiting to be hit by light energy so that they can pass on that energy to an electron acceptor molecule. So that's the first stage of photosynthesis. We'll see later on there's a second stage called the light independent stage, and that occurs in the liquid. So these two phases of photosynthesis, one occurs in the membrane and the other occurs in the liquid part of the of the chloroplast. If you look at a picture of the chloroplast, you notice that there are little plasmid-like molecules, small circular pieces of DNA that occur inside the chloroplast, and these are extra chromosomal pieces of DNA. They're outside the chromosome, but they are important for photosynthesis. They code for the enzymes that are needed for photosynthesis. Please remember, we don't look at this. Excuse me. We don't focus on any of the enzymes that are come into play then during all this these various steps in the photosynthesis reaction we look at. But don't forget that every step of the way, enzymes and different enzymes, a whole host of them, are going to be involved in bringing the whole photosynthesis reaction to fruition. So the dark stage, like I said, happens in the fluid. That's the light independent stage. What's necessary for photosynthesis to happen? Light is necessary for photosynthesis to happen. Obviously, the first stage is called the light dependent stage, or the light phase, and it's on these membranes that first stage happens. So that first stage is the light stage, and that's when the chlorophyll molecules come into play, and they're the ones that are sticking out of the surface of these membranes here. You can see these membranes are arranged these are circular membranes. It's hard to see that in 2D, but these are piles of coins. So imagine that each of these is a coin stacked one on top of another, and they're linked together by other flat membranes. Okay, so that's where you'll find the chlorophyll molecules. So the light stage, like I said, we'll look at this in detail. Just flick through this for the time being. And we'll come to the light. The first stage is the light stage. It only happens in the presence of light. Light is necessary for this stage to happen. There are two alternative possible pathways involved in the light stage, and they both occur, like we just said, on the internal membranes of the chloroplast. That's where the chlorophyll molecules are going to be hanging out. The first pathway we'll look at is cyclic. The second pathway is non-cyclic, and we'll see what that means in a minute. This first pathway then we're going to look at is known very complicatedly as cyclic photophosphorylation. Now, just to break that down a bit, cyclic, because we'll see in a second the electrons that leap off chlorophyll, these excited electrons that are hit by light and are full of energy now, have taken the light energy, they leap off chlorophyll, but those electrons eventually will come back to chlorophyll molecules. So that's why it's called cyclic. It's photophosphorylation because light is involved. It's the use of light to create ATP. It's the phosphorylation reaction whereby ATP is manufactured. So that's why it's photophosphorylation. It's the use of light energy to manufacture ATP using this phosphorylation we'll look at in a minute. So energized electrons will leave chlorophyll. They will pass on their energy, and that energy will be used to generate ATP in this pathway 1. And then, like I said, eventually these electrons will pass back to chlorophyll. We'll see in pathway 2 then, this is non-cyclic. It's also photophosphorylation because chlorophyll is involved, but the electrons that leave chlorophyll don't end up going back to chlorophyll molecules. They're whisked away to the dark stage by what you might call an electron taxi. We'll see in a minute, called NADP, and we'll see how that works. So these electrons don't return to chlorophyll, hence it's non-cyclic. Okay, so let's look at this light stage pathway 1 first of all. This is the cyclic pathway. We have light hits chlorophyll. Chlorophyll becomes energized now, or rather electrons on chlorophyll become energized. So these electrons will become so excited or so energized that they will leave chlorophyll, and they will be taken by an electron acceptor molecule, the name of which we don't have to look at in this course, but this electron acceptor molecule will take these excited electrons, and they will be passed on then, these excited electrons will be passed on to a series of proteins on the surface of the membrane, the inner membranes in the chloroplast, a series of proteins called the electron transport chain. Collectively we'll just call them that. But know that then what happens is that as these electrons, these electrons that are excited electrons, as they move from one protein to another along this electron transport chain, think of it as like a pass the parcel for electrons, and as each protein passes its electrons, energy from this excited electron is given off. So what it's doing is it's calming down. So this electron calms down, and its excess energy, as we said before, is used to drive this reaction of adenosine diphosphate added to inorganic phosphate molecules. So ADP and phosphates are used to generate ATP. So energy is used to drive this reaction, and now some chemical energy. Remember, it's the light energy that was taken by the electron, taken by chlorophyll, passed on with these electrons, that eventually ends up as chemical energy in the ATP molecule. And it's in those chemical bonds that you find that energy that was the light energy. Now this electron, just to finish the story, then the electron that is now calmed down because it's passed off all of its excess energy onto for the manufacture of ATP, this now de-energized or low energy electron is now able to return to chlorophyll, so that chlorophyll has its full complement of electrons. So that's why we call this cyclic pathway. It's cyclic photophosphorylation. Like I said, photophosphorylation, the use of light to drive this reaction here, which is the phosphorylation of ADP. Phosphorylation meaning adding a phosphate group to make ATP. So that's pathway 1. Pathway 1, we'll just flick through the text there, and we'll just to see then that pathway 2, when we look at it, is going to start out in a similar way. So just to go back again, as we said with pathway 1, light hits chlorophyll. Chlorophyll gets all excited. Excited electrons leave chlorophyll, and they are taken by an electron acceptor in pairs. Rather, they're taken by electrons acceptor and they're passed on in pairs to NADP+. Now this, like I said before, is a taxi. Think of taxis that are on a Friday night. If you stand on Stephen's Green in Dublin, you'll see taxis leaving full, or at least with passengers, heading out to, for example, let's see, if you're heading back to South Dublin or something, then this taxi will come in. It's empty as it is. NADP+ is an empty taxi. It will come and it will pick up 2 passengers, these 2 electrons. So these electrons then are going to be taken by NADP, and we'll see in a second they will end up being it becomes NADP- now, because it's taken on 1 electron, which makes it neutral, and then a second electron, which makes it overall NADP-, NADP-, single minus. Now this NADP-, we'll see in a minute, will combine with another atom or another ion, and we'll see in a second how that happens. Now meanwhile, while NADP has already taken its 2 electrons, meanwhile chlorophyll has lost electrons, and these electrons are taken now by NADP, and they will not return to chlorophyll, unlike in pathway 1. So this is non-cyclic photophosphorylation. But chlorophyll is faced with a problem. Chlorophyll now is devoid of electrons, and it can't continue in that situation. It has to have a full complement of electrons. It can't last that long in this situation where it's lost electron. It's hemorrhaging electrons, if you like, as it's being bombarded. Molecules are being bombarded with light, and electrons are leaving. So, if you like, it looks around for its any possible sources of electrons, and it sees, unusually in the living world, it sees water molecules as a source of these electrons. So chlorophyll will attract or will draw these electrons from the water molecules, and as these electrons are dragged over to chlorophyll, they will be dragged through an electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain is similarly to pathway 1. As the electron is passed from one protein to another along this, past the parcel of different proteins, playing a game with the electrons, if you like, they're passing these electrons on. As the electrons are passed on, energy will be given off, so ATP will be created. Now this H2O molecule has now lost electrons, so what happens here is central to the whole process of photosynthesis. This is what's known as photolysis, and it is the fact that light has caused the splitting of water. So photolysis is where light energy splits a molecule, any kind of molecule. And we're looking at, in this case, we're looking at the splitting of water. So it's the photolysis of water, whereby electrons are lost to go back to chlorophyll via the electron transport chain. Water molecules split into oxygen, which is lost as gas, largely excreted through the stomata of the leaf, but also some of it is used in respiration in the plant. Largely low, like I said, there's an excess, so it is lost and excreted. So, in addition to electrons and oxygen, of course, hydrogen atoms, or hydrogen ions, if you like, protons, which are what hydrogen ions are, seeing as they don't have any neutrons. They're just a proton in a nucleus with an electron going around. If you take the electron away, what you're left with is just a proton in a nucleus. So H+ ions are also known as protons. These protons then, of course, are attracted to NADP- because these are positively charged, these are negatively charged. When they combine then, and there's a pool of these protons ready to be taken away by the NADP- taxi. Remember, this taxi now has 2 passengers on board. It's got 2 electrons. It's now going to take a hydrogen ion or a proton on board as well. So these 3 passengers will be taken, and what we in the form of an NADPH molecule taken to the dark stage. Now, once the 2 electrons and the proton are dumped off or dropped off at their destination, the dark stage, then this taxi will come back. So it's in a constant cycle. This taxi is coming in, picking up this NADP+ taxi, coming in, picking up electrons, picking up proton, off to the dark stage, and then comes back again once it's dropped off its passengers. So this is known as non-cyclic photophosphorylation, because, as you can see, it's non-cyclic electron transport. The electrons that are taken from chlorophyll go off to the dark stage. Electrons from the splitting of water are what are used to provide chlorophyll with its full complement of electrons. So I don't show it. He doesn't show here, but ATP is generated. Just to bear that in mind, ATP is generated again in both the non-cyclic electron transport and in the cyclic pathway 1 we looked at just a minute ago. What's also a product of the non-cyclic electron transport, then, apart from NADPH, which is a product, you also have water oxygen gas being a product, and then, like we said up here, we have ATP molecules being generated too. So just to summarize then, we'll just flick through this. It's just text describing what happened. Okay, so just to summarize, we have the light dependent stage, or the light phase, where ATP is generated in a cyclic photophosphorylation reaction, and we also have non-cyclic, where NADP+ comes, whisks away the 2 electrons that left chlorophyll and brings them off to the dark stage. Water is used to generate to provide electrons for chlorophyll. Chlorophyll attracts these electrons, and as it does so, the splitting of water results in oxygen gas being produced, and also a proton pool being generated, which supplies NADP- with its final passenger in the form of hydrogens. We'll see that these hydrogens are essential in the dark stage for the production of glucose. But as I said before, ATP is generated then from ADP and phosphate. You get the generation of ATP. So this is what's known as non-cyclic photophosphorylation. This side of this mode of the light-dependent stage, this pathway 1, as opposed to this pathway 2, as opposed to pathway 1, you get the generation of ATP. So if we look at the summary then, overall, if we're looking at the light-dependent stage, we're looking at ATP being generated, we're looking at NADPH being generated, we're looking at oxygen being generated. So they're the 3 products of the light-dependent stage. Now if we move to the second stage, the light-independent stage, no light is required for this reaction. It's a bit of an academic point, to be honest with you, because photosynthesis can't happen in the dark anyway. So just a technical point that this is known as the dark stage, not because it needs the dark, but because it doesn't need the light. So it's a bit of a misnomer to call it the dark stage. It doesn't happen in the dark. It must happen in the light. Photosynthesis, of course, has to happen, requires light. But it can happen in the darkness, in theory. This occurs in the liquid part. We said that the light-dependent stage, or those 2 pathways we looked at in the light-dependent stage, that light stage, happen on the membranes in the chloroplast. This happens in the liquid part. And what's required is the ATP that's generated from pathway 1, the NADPH, from pathway 1 and pathway 2, the ATP. NADPH is generated in pathway 2 of the light phase. That's the taxi, full of its passengers of electrons and protons. And carbon dioxide, this is the molecule we haven't seen come into play yet since we looked at the chemical reaction. Carbon dioxide is going to be one of the main ingredients then for the generation or the manufacture of glucose in the dark stage. The dark stage is actually very simple then. CO2 is taken from the air by the plant. You notice that, you'll see in a second, that it's this oxygen here that goes to make up glucose, and the oxygen from water, remember, was lost in the splitting of water in pathway 1, so the oxygen from water is not used in the manufacture of glucose. We'll see now that NADPH, this taxi, brings electrons and protons. H is the proton, this is a proton H plus ions. They're combined with the CO2 to make glucose. So we'll see how that happens. All driven by the fuel that is ATP. And of course, as usual, enzymes come into play that we'll just ignore, but we shouldn't really ignore. We just don't deal with any detail in the leaving cert course. So carbon dioxide is combined with these H's here from NADPH. This is the proton that was carried by the taxi. The H's and the electrons are provided as part of as the ingredients, one of the ingredients along with CO2 for this reaction to form glucose, and the whole thing is driven by the breakdown of ATP molecules to give off energy and the resulting ADP plus phosphate. So that's it, the products of the light stage and the dark stage. In summary then, the light stage, the products are ATP, NADPH, that's the taxi full of its passengers, and oxygen, which is largely waste. The products of the dark stage are glucose. NADP plus now is the empty taxi that's recycled, and it goes back as an empty taxi after dropping off its passengers back into town, back into the light stage to pick up another passenger load. ADP is also recycled in, will be available then to make more ATP, and of course inorganic phosphates are always available then in the chloroplast. So next video we'll look at the effect of light on photosynthesis, but for now I'll sign off.